Welcome to the Utah State School Board Debate Coalition Debate Series for the 2020 primary elections. Tonight, we are excited to hear from our District 10 candidates, and our other debates will be hosted next week on the 16th and 17th. So we're excited to be hosting these debates online this year, and we hope that this can reach more people in the comfort of their home, either now or later. This will be recorded and can be found on the Hinckley Institute's YouTube page. So this coalition is made up of Sutherland Institute, the Utah Association of Public Charter Schools, Hinckley Institute, Deseret News, and the United Way of Salt Lake. We are all partners in hosting these debates because we understand the importance of the work done by the state school board on behalf of Utah students. And we believe in empowering voters with information about those who will represent them. And especially during a year where there's been so much change and uncertainty, people want to know who their education leaders are, and we hope to help Utahns in this effort. So this debate will last about an hour, and I, as moderator, will ask the first series of questions, and then we'll open it up to anyone who's watching online, and they can offer their comments and questions on the YouTube channel, and when we'll get to those in the second half as well. So let's now turn to our candidates, Molly Hart and David Linford, for their opening statements and introductions. And David actually won the coin toss prior to this, so we will start with David.
Thank you, Christine. It's nice to be on this debate. I appreciate the Sutherland Institute and the Hinckley Institute for hosting this. I also appreciate Molly for joining me this. The voters in our district are very fortunate. I think we have two very good candidates and possibilities here. And I appreciate this opportunity to explain how I feel about state education. My goal as a candidate is to reunite parents, principals, and teachers, and the accountability that can take place between those three groups of people. Mostly, I want the State Board of Education to stay out of the way and to allow the parents, principals, and teachers to decide how teachers in their area, at their schools, and their classrooms are educated.
Thank you. All right, Molly.
Hi, I'm Molly Hart. I also echo David's thank you for hosting the debate and the opportunity to share views and hear from constituents, their concerns, and the things on their mind regarding education. I am a current principal. A little bit of background on me. I currently work in education and have for about 20 years. I'm also a parent, and I care very deeply about education, and I'd like to see education be, Utah education to be at the very, very forefront in many areas, including digital learning and early childhood, and just really putting out a graduate that has the best chance of success in today's economy and today's world. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Those are great opening statements. So we'll actually just go into some questions now. This time we'll start with Molly. In your opinion, what are the two most important functions performed by the State Board of Education?
Two of the most important things that the State Board does is set standards and signal direction for our Utah schools. We have a large, different state. We have different areas that have very, very different circumstances for students, but we're all Utahns. And setting a goal, setting standards, and setting targets gives us a common language for all of us to kind of to target in our schools and in our communities, and gives us a common language to talk about education so that we can move forward as a state.
Thank you. Okay, David.
My turn? So I think the two most important things that the State Board of Education can do is, first of all, get out of the way between the parents and the teachers and the principals. And I think the second most important thing they can do is tell the state legislature to also get out of the way. Right now, we have both groups trying to tell different schools, different boards, different teachers and parents how they should educate their children. And I think mostly that guidance ends up being a problem rather than a help. I had a teacher of a child a few years ago who was a wonderful teacher, did amazing things, taught Shakespeare, had them perform Shakespeare in class, and because of board regulations the next year, different teacher, same teacher, different child of mine couldn't do the Shakespeare because of some new regulations. Get out of the way.
Okay, great. Thank you. David, so in your opening statements, we had a little bit of an introduction to you. Tell us a little bit more about how your experience qualifies you to represent residents in your district on the State Board of Education.
That's great. So I've had children in public education for about 20 years. I will for about 12 more years. I have a pretty big family, wide range of ages. So my experience mainly is that I've been a parent and basically a customer of education in Utah for a long time and will be for a while more. I've taught at the University of Utah, so I've been a teacher. I work in technology, and I'm open-minded. And I am one who is willing to say, here's a good idea I have, but in your local area, I want you to decide. I want you to have your good ideas. I want you to decide how your children are educated.
Right. Thank you. Same question to you, Molly.
Sure. As an educator for 20 plus years in multiple states, I have a lot of different experiences. I've seen a lot of different things come and go. I understand how policies are enacted at the local level, so I know what schools need. I know what the common pitfalls are. I know when to get out of the way and when to provide more guidance or more support. I know how to listen to parents, but still hold firm to the goals and objectives of a school. I know how to listen even when it's hard and even when the issues at hand are emotional and not easy. But that's the reality of working in education, and that's the beauty of it as well. And I just know that my experience would allow me to get in there and get to work right away, which is what we need in the middle of a situation like we have now.
Okay, and we'll stick with you to answer first on this next one. So the coronavirus pandemic has taken a toll on education budgets statewide. Without the actual numbers available right now, how would you compensate for this loss of income? And a second question along with that is, where do you believe the budget should be cut?
Sure. I think one thing we need to do is step back and take a look at our priorities, because our priorities may be different than they were 3 months ago. We need to reassess. We need to, what I am not in support of or in favor of is a straight across the board cut. I think we need to use more of a surgeon's scalpel kind of approach and really look at programs that really cuts that hurt the least. It's an unfortunate situation, but it is our reality. I think we can cut in areas where the programs may not have yet started, programs that we may not be utilizing in this reality, but now is not the time to cut custodial budgets for cleaning or digital learning initiatives. We have to look and reassess our priorities and look at where our cuts will hurt the least. I'm really concerned that our teachers have the tools that they need to teach in a digital universe, because we need to be prepared for that.
Right. Thank you. David.
Yeah, so I think local schools, local principals, local districts should be allowed to do the cuts where they need to. Not only can we be surgical, we can be different around the state. One of the problems I think with the current budgeting system is there's so many earmarks and so many channels for money that a principal in St. George is given the same money to do the same thing for the same program as a principal downtown Salt Lake or in Cache Valley. totally different areas, different needs. I think mostly the money should be the decisions on where to budget money should be decided locally. And maybe that decision is to go with technology. Maybe that decision is to go with more teachers. Maybe that decision is to ramp up who knows what. In fact, I don't know, but I know that principals do know, and I want to trust them with those decisions.
Okay, great. So as we said, there have been a lot of effects because of the pandemic. Another dealt with people's quick adaptations to content delivery. So half of the school year was basically the schools were closed and people had to move to an online sort of a delivery. So knowing that and the possibility that might continue this fall, how should the State Board of Education respond to or support the need for better online education?
One thing they can do, I think it's my turn, right?
Yes. Yeah.
One thing they can do is to remove all the requirements for all the money. Right now, we have money that's earmarked for this or that. The school should be able to make the decisions on where they need to spend the money. And if it's technology where a school needs to spend the money, then they should be allowed to do that. If maybe that's with individual students, maybe there's students that don't have the access they need or the computers they need. Schools need to be able to make those decisions. If we've seen anything, it's that schools, teachers, and principals adapt actually remarkably to this. Now, some succeeded more than others, but we can take the lessons we've learned. They can take the lessons they've learned and continue to adapt, continue to make changes. The last thing I want the state school board is deciding is, now you have to spend this money on this type of technology or this teacher or whatever it is. Schools, principals, parents, districts, they can make those decisions. Let's let them.
Thank you. Yeah, Tamale.
Yes, I believe that we need to consider what the state can do well for schools in pivoting to more online education and dealing with the effects of the coronavirus and possibly rolling closures. Things like accessing the supply chain to get needed supplies quicker than individual schools or districts can, connecting people in the state that can help us, for instance, with broadband access for students. That's not something that individual schools can do, but the state could really help with. Yes, there's a need for customization, but there's also a need for guidance in times of a crisis. And the state board can provide that guidance and support, and also stand ready to waive whatever requirements needed to be waived and be ready to provide support as the districts and schools need it.
Thank you. Okay, final pandemic related question for you. As you know, these changes disrupted Utah's state mandated assessments. In your opinion, should these be resumed once the pandemic has ended? Do you believe that they're effective in evaluating success and areas for improvement? So we'll start with Molly.
Absolutely. I'm glad that's asked. There's a misconception about assessment. There's assessment, which is absolutely necessary. It's communication between a teacher and parents on how well a student is doing in school, and it's absolutely critical. What's not effective or helpful is when that testing is external or high stakes. We need to trust our teachers more. We need to rely on teacher assessments rather than external assessments. That testing is a snapshot. It's one point in time, and it is not an entire picture of a student, a school, or a teacher. And it should not be used as such. Quite frankly, there are better ways to measure progress. And so I'm excited about that conversation continuing after this pandemic coronavirus is through.
Thank you. Thank you. David.
I've been impressed with the things that have been waived or changed or disbanded due to coronavirus because they weren't essential. And I think assessments are a small piece of an evaluation of how a student's doing, how a school's doing, how a teacher is doing. But when I meet with a teacher about one of my children, they show me their test scores, but mostly I just talk to them. So how are they in class? How are they learning? Do they like learning? How are they doing with their friends? It's a piece, but it's such a small piece that whether it comes back or not, I'm mainly interested in the opinions and the things that my teachers tell me about my kids. And frankly, what my kids tell me about their teachers too. That's what's important.
Okay. Thank you. We'll start with David on this one. And this is also kind of a two-part question, so we might just give 90 seconds or something for this in case you need that. So as you know, the State Board of Education distributes more than $4 billion per year to school districts and charter schools. So first, what qualifies you to manage this budget? And what accountability measures should the state use to ensure that school districts and charter schools use money appropriately?
That's great. So this is how the state distributes money is crazy. There's over 41 different ways that schools, charter schools, public schools receive money from the state. Every single one of those ways comes with regulations, requirements, reporting, and limits how schools can actually spend that money. So this stream may require it to be spent on technology. That stream may be required to be spent on class size. Well, maybe all your problems are technology related, or maybe everything you want to spend money on is class size related. I don't know. You know, principals know, teachers know, parents know, and I want to allow them to make those decisions. Those 41 different ways that schools should get money should be reduced drastically. Most 80% of students, 80% of schools should get their money just as a lump sum and be allowed to spend that money how they see fit. Special education should be funded, rural assistance for transportation and issues that may come up specifically for rural students and classes. There's at-risk people who are incarcerated, people where English is their second language, that may need different and separate funding. But mostly funding should be given to parents and principals and teachers and allow them to assess how that money is spent. There's transparency. Our state auditor has great ways of looking into how money is spent and creating transparency and bringing people accountability like that. But mostly, parents, principals, and teachers should be accountable to each other on how that money is spent. Why have the state school board in the middle of those 41 different ways of funding? It's a nightmare.
Okay, thank you. And so we'll go to Molly. We'll give you 30 seconds extra as well to respond to that. Thank you.
Funding in a lot of cases for the state board is simply a pass through from the legislature. So while it's would be nice to have in some cases more unrestricted funds, the fact is those funds are given with a purpose that the legislature has set. So many of those mandates are created by legislature, and the state board then has to interpret that in order for schools to know which direction to go. So that guidance is absolutely critical in knowing how to meet the expectations of the auditor and understand what that money in particular is for. They're the traffic signs of how to spend and where to go and what the priorities are of our legislature, which is of course voted in by the public. So it's the way that the public speaks about school. It goes through the legislature, then to the state board, and then to districts and schools as necessary. It's important that that money is earned by the taxpayer, not by the legislature, not by the members of the state board. So there has to be transparency, and it has to be spent in the way that it was intended.
Great answers from both of you. Thank you. Okay, we'll start with Molly on this one. So many people believe that public education is inherently political because we're dealing with taxpayer dollars. Others believe that public education should be free of partisan, controversy. How do you view this issue?
Well, as a sitting principal, it's neither and it's both. It's a false dichotomy. It's political because the money that we get is taxpayer money, and it's collected and redistributed through a political process. But when you ask a 9-year-old or you ask a parent, to talk about schools, they are a lot less interested in politics than they are making sure that it's a safe and full of education, full of love classroom where their students are learning and excited to be. So it's both. There's not a decision I make as a principal that doesn't have political ramifications. But at the same time, what I do is not political at all. And so I'm speaking as an educator on that one. It's both and it's neither.
Thank you. David.
So we actually this is an interesting transition we have, because previously this has been a nonpartisan race, and now we're transitioning to where this is a partisan race. Here we are having a debate for a Republican primary. Here is the problem, and actually Molly described the problem in my opinion. She says the money is taxed, and it goes up through the legislature and governor, and then back down through the State Board of Education. And so the accountability loop is long and goes through Salt Lake. That accountability loop needs to end. As a conservative, well, generally I think Democrats think that the answers to our problems lie with the government. And as a conservative Republican, I don't even think the government knows the right questions, let alone the answers. I want to get out of the way. I want that loop that goes up through the state. I want to close down that loop and have the accountability loop be parents, principals, and teachers. Give the power and the accountability down at that level so that people can make good decisions for them. They don't have to be thinking about what this is funding and what that is funding. They can think, what is the best decision for our school?
Great. And I'll just drill down on this issue a little bit more. So we'll start with you again. So there has been a debate in recent years over whether the state school board should be elected as partisan or nonpartisan candidates, or whether they should be appointed by the governor. What do you believe is the best way for the school board members to be chosen, and why?
Well, I think if you're appointed, then you're accountable to who? You're accountable to the governor. As an elected person, I am accountable to the same people that I think should have accountability in education, parents in my district. So by bringing the accountability closer to the people, I think that's the best solution. The fact, whether it's nonpartisan or partisan, that just allows the party to decide who can run. People can still run as independents. That's still an option that's available, and so it doesn't have to be partisan if they don't want. But I think the accountability loop should be tightened. Do away with, there's no way it should be appointed by the governor.
Thank you. Molly.
I've worked in states where the state board is appointed. I've worked in states where the state board is elected. I've actually worked in a state where they were in the middle of transitioning from one system to the other. I think that ultimately, I do think that the accountability needs to rest with the public, and it needs to be you need to be accountable to the people. The concerns I have are really with the process. If it were to be an appointed board, I'd want to know about those accountability measures. I do think that there's value in having a board that understands education and has some information and some background and points of reference in order to make wise decisions. But ultimately, voting seems to be where it just seems to go from a pendulum to shift from one side to the other in states. So, but I like the people having the voice.
Thank you. All right, so and Molly, we'll start with you. Who do you believe should be the primary driver of education policy? As you know, in Utah can get a little bit sticky. There's some overlap there. So do you believe it's the State Board of Education, the legislature, the governor, local school districts, charter schools, somebody else? And why do you feel that way?
Well, ultimately, the control needs to rest with the local communities. That's the easy answer. But it's more complicated than that, because then you're, the local communities signal what they want out of an education system. It goes up through the legislature. The legislature makes rules and appropriations, which is what the world we're living in right now is looking at those appropriations. It's handed over to citizens on the state school board to interpret those and put them in education language. And then it's up to the local boards and the local schools and the charters to figure out how that looks for them. And then it goes back on up again. So it's a constant conversation, and it needs to continue back and forth. It's not as simple as just local control, or but ultimately it is local control.
Thank you. All right, David.
So I think Molly's exactly right. The current system is there's this massive loop that goes up through the state, and frankly, maybe this is naive, but I don't see why it should have to do that. I think the primary driver of education should be parents, principals, and teachers. They're right there. They know what is best for their community. They know what is best for their children. Anything that can support that, as far as the legislature and the state school board of education, I'm all for it. Anything that lessens that accountability and lessens that control, I'm against it. I think we can actually return that control more locally. It's not Pollyannish. It should happen. It can happen.
Thank you. So we'll kind of stay on this vein of the different entities that are working in education. So over the years, the state board's relationship with the state legislature has waxed and waned. How do you envision the legislature and the state board working together? And maybe more specifically, what would you do to foster that relationship, foster a positive relationship? So, sorry, David.
So, relationships are important. And certainly the state legislature makes the laws, and then the state school board helps to enact them. But there's also pushback the other direction. The state legislature asks the state school board about issues and what they should do. So maintaining good relationships, certainly with our local legislative leaders, our senators and state legislature leaders, is important, because it's in those relationships that you can help them to realize that maybe they don't know everything, and maybe taking their hands off the reins a little bit, allowing parents and principals and teachers to make some of these decisions is good. As soon as someone gets power, they think, oh, I can make the decisions that's best for everybody else. It takes a truly powerful person to say, let's let other people, let's let the people it affects the most make those decisions. So I would always be encouraging the state legislature to allow the local people to make the decisions.
Thank you. Molly.
I think it's important. It's a matter of communication and understanding being able to be a resource. I need to understand what legislators can and want to do and accomplish. They need to understand how I, as a state board member, feel about things and what's important to me. I need to be able to provide expertise and feedback and guidance. So, and then the two parties need to work to find the best solution for Utah students. It is a relationship, and it's one where communication is vitally important, and both bodies are working for the same people, the general public and the students of Utah. So it's important to put small differences aside, let go of partisan politics or politics in general, and really consider what we want for the students and families, for the schools and the districts of the state, and then work together to accomplish that in the most efficient and effective way possible.
Thank you. Okay, going in a little bit of a different direction here. There's lots of criticisms of public education looking the same today as it did 100 years ago. There are many students working out of textbooks older than they are. So how will you work to modernize public education and ensure that Utah students are prepared to succeed in a technology-driven economy? And so, yeah, we'll start with Molly.
Absolutely. I think the state is doing some excellent work. If you look at the work, the portrait of a graduate, we're looking at the competencies that we expect students to have when they leave Utah schools, no matter what kind of school it is. I would be concerned about a school where the textbooks are older than the students, and that is frightening. We are moving to a digital world, and with the corona virus, we are moving quicker than we expected to. Utah is really doing better than many states, and that's because of the work that's been done on digital learning. We just need to continue that work, and we need to not let that get caught up in, again, politics or get distracted from that. I don't think that there are that many students in the state that are not accessing technology at this point. We can always do better, and we are working on doing better, but we've made great strides, and I think we just need to continue to build on that.
Thank you. David.
Yeah, so some schools, it may be a problem of their textbooks are too old, or some schools may have decided to go completely digital, or some schools, it depends on who their students are, on what level of technology they have available to them at home, all sorts of decisions. I think the funding should be available for students, for local districts and principals and teachers to decide how they're going to teach their kids. A 10-year-old book about ancient history may be perfectly fine. A 10-year-old book about the American Revolution, maybe that's fine itself. But a 10-year-old book about, web technology, that's not going to be adequate. All those decisions should be made locally. The state shouldn't. So maybe the state board should think, oh, we're going to solve that problem by sending this funding down for textbooks. Well, maybe there's a district that's decided to go a different direction textbook-wise. Let's let them do that. Let's not like mandate money being spent in this area or that. Let them decide how to spend their money.
Great. Thank you. I will ask one final moderator question, and then we'll shift over to some audience questions from people that are listening. So the role of the state board in shaping standards and assessment has been somewhat controversial. Where we get them, what's the content, how they're used. So in your opinion, what is the state board's appropriate role in shaping standards and assessments? I'll start with David.
Yes, how schools should be assessed and how teachers should be assessed, what the standards for teachers are, that should all be done locally. When we compare a school in Draper to a school in Cache Valley or West Valley, what good are we doing? Really, what good are we doing? We should be comparing our schools in the opinions of the principals and teachers and parents to how our schools were last year. Apples and apples, areas to areas, not different areas. The state school board saying, well, everybody needs to meet this standard. Well, maybe everybody shouldn't have to meet that standard. Every area should decide what they're going to do. the state school board needs to stay as much as possible out of standards and assessments.
Thank you. Molly.
I have a little bit of a different take on that. You can't get anywhere without a map, and you can't move an entire state forward and make sure that you're utilizing your tax dollars and your resources effectively without some sort of roadmap, some sort of guidance. In every district and school that I've ever worked in utilizes those supports. In past times, yes. In times, No Child Left Behind. In some of the darker times in education, accountability was imposed rather than schools provided with resources. But quite frankly, without those standards and without that North Star, without that guidance, teachers and students, schools and districts don't necessarily know where they're headed or what's expected of them. So those are important boundaries to set, or important guidelines to set for schools to then jump off and figure out how they're going to do it. Never would I suggest that a state board determine actual curriculum. That's up to local boards, charter boards, and such. But to have that guidance is absolutely critical.
Thank you. Hey, thank you both for really thoughtful, great responses. We're going to move to audience questions. So here's this first one. What role should the State Board of Education play in helping students, teachers, and schools understand the divisions over police and race? So we will start with Molly.
Okay. Can you repeat the first part of the question?
Yes. What role should the State Board of Education play in helping students, teachers, and schools understand the divisions over police and race?
The divisions over police and race.
Yeah.
We've been working on teaching civic concepts of civic education, concepts of critical thinking. Those things have been part of education for a long time. A lot of what we do is to create a citizen of the world that can be successful and can contribute to a community. We've got a lot of work to do in breaking down some of the problems that we have in society. We haven't shied away from addressing problems in society throughout I mean, that's part of what education does. We have a lot of conversation to be had. We have a lot of things that we need to talk about and figure out ways to engage our students in those types of conversations. One thing's for sure, we want our kids back in school to have those conversations and to help them process the things that are happening in our communities.
Thank you. David.
You know, Molly mentioned something I think is very important. It's critical thinking. We need to teach our kids how to engage in conversation, debate, in critical thinking, so that they can evaluate the news, evaluate what's going on, and rather than creating quote unquote safe spaces for our students, we need to make our children, teach our children to be able to handle different circumstances, different spaces. The problems our country has are largely possible to be cured by educating our kids on how to deal with people, how to disagree with someone, but still know that you can love them, how to evaluate a situation and know who's in the right and who's in the wrong, and how to stand strong with those who are in the right. You know, we have great police officers in our country. We have a few bad apples. We have great kids in our country. They can learn, they can grow, they can know this difference. They're just taught to think.
Thank you. Okay, we'll start with David on this next question from audience. What role should advocacy groups, unions, or outside experts play in the State Board of Education's rulemaking process?
You know, they can speak as an organization funded or supported by taxpayers in Utah. I think that the more control that the State Board of Education has over how funding is spent, then the more they'll be lobbied by larger organizations. When the funding is decided at a local and a more local level, local teachers, local parents, local principals, then the bigger organizations just will naturally bow out because they don't have the larger interest in mind. I think when big organizations have big interests, parents, principals, and teachers have the interest in the local schools. That's where the power should be.
Thank you. All right, Molly, same question for you.
I think it's important to hear from all constituents and all groups of constituents. It makes decisions better. It uncovers problems in decision making, or it uncovers problems that we didn't maybe have. Maybe they evolved or grew. Groups like that need to be involved. Any type of group, I would hope, come to the table to help solve problems. You know, whenever anybody brings a problem, my first reaction is to listen, and then to say, well, what are some of your ideas for a possible solution? Because those groups know the problem sometimes much better than the people that they're speaking to, and you can learn so much from them. And ultimately, decisions are better when we hear from them. I hear from parents and community members regularly, and they're advocating for their individual students, for their neighbors, for their community, for things that are important to them. And the most important thing to do is to listen, because there's an answer and a solution in there somewhere. There's a win-win.
Thank you. We'll start with Molly on this next audience question. One of the most controversial issues the State Board confronts is the standards around sex education. What role do you think comprehensive sex education should play in the state's education standards?
Well, first of all, I think that goes right along with, it's my response, correct? Yeah. It goes right along with the last question. You've got to listen to the groups. You've got to hear the concerns, but you also have to talk to and listen to the experts and what's been done poorly in other places, what the local communities want. You have to, and that's where that flexibility for local communities is so important, because individual communities can feel very strongly one way or another, and they need the freedom to be able to determine what's best for their community. But the State Board also needs to provide resources for individuals or individual schools or communities that need those resources, so that wherever they fall on that spectrum, they have what they need to do what it is they want to do in their individual communities and schools.
Thank you. David.
So this is a great example of an issue that has so many different opinions, so many different ways that they think it should be taught. I have maybe a strong opinion on how I think my children should be taught on this, but it takes a humble person and a humble board perhaps to recognize that they don't have the answers for every community, for every school, even for every person in Utah. So why have that be a Utah State School Board decision? Why not have that be as local as possible? Parents, principals, and teachers, the resources are out there. Nobody's struggling to find the resources. Everybody, if they want, can create a curriculum, can find a curriculum and suggest to be taught at their local school with their local school district. Why have the state school board involved in that at all?
Thank you. Okay, Another question from the public. Charter schools and school districts compete for students and state funding. How do you see these different parts of public education working together? We'll start with David.
Yeah, so I live in Draper, and I have 9 children. 6 of them have gone to charter schools at some time or another. All of them have been in standard public schools as well. What's interesting is, depending on the one of my children, at one time or another, one school is better, maybe a standard public school, maybe a charter school. Those choices have made all of the schools better. We actually some time ago decided to pull our children out of a school that's about 100 yards from us. Short time later, there was a charter school available. We had some kids there. Our local school got so much better. They introduced Chinese immersion as an option, and we put some kids back into that school, which is our local public school. They're competing, and in competing, they're making each other better. Local schools get better, charter schools get better, teachers get better, kids get a better education when they have that choice. I'm all for empowering parents to have a choice on what to do with their kids.
Thank you. Molly.
I don't necessarily see it as a competition. I'm not competing for students. I teach who comes through my door. I try to meet the needs of the local community. Sometimes other schools, charter school might have a program that meets the needs of individual students better. And that's not a competition necessarily. That's an individual decision and choice by families. I have received charter students. I have students that have withdrawn and gone to charter schools, and I have given advice on questions that the community members have asked about what would be best for their child. There's also homeschool, and there's online school, and there's so many different options in the education sphere now. And we're really moving into a world where that's more, education can be really hybrid. You can do partial online, you can do partial at school. It's not a competition, and it's not one or the other. Sometimes it's both. Sometimes it's neither. And we just need to make sure that there's a variety of choices so that as many Utahns as possible are getting what they need for their students and what's best for their family. And yeah, individual families, that can be different from one child to the next. That's the beauty of the options that we have in Utah, and that needs to continue.
Thank you. Final question before we move to closing remarks, and we will start with Molly on this. If education is a state and a local issue, should the state board be working with the U.S. Department of Education? When and how?
I am just not a fan of the Utah, or of the state, the United States Education Department. Department of Education is too far from our local communities to make decisions that really hit the mark for us. Now, having said that, we do receive funding, and there are some areas due to some civil rights legislation and some school lunches, some areas where we do receive federal funding, and we don't have an alternative. But by and large, we need to be very, very careful. Education is a state's right, not a federal. Should not be in the purview of the federal government. When the federal government takes a stand in education, we generally have several years of having to make up for it after it runs its course. No Child Left Behind is an example of that. I really just don't support the federal government being involved in education matters. But unfortunately, it's a reality that we just need to be mindful of and continue to try to find other ways of funding our schools.
Thank you. Okay, David.
I would have to agree with most everything Molly said on that one. I like to say that I support the Board of Education, the U.S. Education Department that George Washington had, which was none. There is no reason for the U.S. government to be involved at all. And as we've seen with No Child Left Behind and Common Core, it just creates a disaster. I would actually extend that even further, though, that I think I would encourage the state legislature to push back on that, our congressmen to push back on that, to reduce the amount of money that has to go to the federal government and then back to the state government. Talk about an accountability loop that's useless. And the same thing applies at the state level. We need to push accountability more local as much as we can. Federal accountability is ridiculous.
Thank you. Okay. We will now move to closing remarks. We'll actually give you 90 seconds to tell us anything else that you would like to say to people who will be listening to this now or later, to introduce yourself or to help them understand your future leadership in education in Utah. So we'll start with David.
Thank you. And thanks again for this great opportunity. And thank you, Molly. This has been nice to hear your views. And I think the voters have two good choices here. So good for them. Thank you for listening to us, voters. And I'm a parent. I've taught at the University of Utah. I work in technology. I'm open to new ideas. But mainly, I'm humble enough to realize the state needs to get out of the business of deciding how your kids are educated. I will listen, but most of my answers are going to be take that opinion to your principal, take that opinion to your teacher, talk to your school boards, and get your school boards to make decisions for your kids. I want to return that accountability loop and tighten it up so that parents, principals, and teachers decide how the children in Utah are educated. It takes humility to say that, because I have lots of great opinions about how I want my kids educated, but maybe that's not going to work for your kid. That's fair. I don't even want to decide how your kid's educated. I want that control over my kids. So that's how I will function at the state school board, is to return the power back to the people, back to the parents, back to great principals like Molly, and back to the teachers.
Thank you. Molly.
As an educator with 20 plus years of experience, I am excited about the opportunity to serve and represent the communities of Sandy, Midvale, Conwood Heights, and Draper at the state board. I would take those concerns, the concerns that you bring, and take them to our legislature and take them to the other state board members to make policies that support our district in providing those choices and operationalizing those things that you'd like to have for your students in schools. I thank y'all for the opportunity to engage in this conversation, but I hope it's not the end of the conversation. To me, legislating and governing and representing is a big communication, a relationship that needs to continue and be nurtured. I want to hear from parents and constituents, and I want to help make it a system where schools and districts and communities can get what they need in order to do the things that they would like for their students. Thank you again for the opportunity. This has been absolutely wonderful. I wish it was in person, and I can't wait to meet more constituents as time goes on. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to both Molly Hart and David Linford, candidates for District 10 for the Utah State Board of Education. Thank you again to the sponsors, the Utah Association of Public Charter Schools, Hinckley Institute, Deseret News, United Way of Salt Lake, and Sutherland Institute. Just a reminder that anyone can watch this, rewatch this on Hinckley Institute's YouTube page. And with that, everyone can have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It's very good to meet you, Molly.
You too, David. Take care.